Chair for Excellence in Women's Health Research, and served as Director of the Johns Hopkins Master in Education for Health Professions Graduate Student Research Program. Nationally, Dr. Jenkins has participated in a variety of scientific positions, such as Chair of the first U.S. Sex and Gender Medical Education Summit, Expert Scientific Reviewer for the National Institutes of Health, Department of Health and Human Services, Health Resources and Services Administration, National Aeronautical and Space Administration, and the National Board of Medical Examiners. Yeah, it's quite a mouthful. Her achievements are almost too numerous to list. She served on several scientific journal editorial boards, and in 2020, her Sex and Gender Impact on Clinical Care, an expert guide for clinicians, was published for Elsevier. Welcome, Dr. Jenkins. I will share. We're so happy to have you here. I'll share your slides with everyone.
Thank you. I'm happy to run my slides if you don't mind, Ariana. Or we can go with you.
No, you can, but you have to upload them in order to.
Yes. So I'm having the technical difficulties today. So I'm going to have Oriana run the slides because there's only a few of them. So you have received so much data during this conference, and I was really honored to be asked to close out the FemTech Summit of 2022. You've heard about some of the challenges we've had, some of the progress that we have, these exciting, innovative efforts to improve women's health, to look at sex-specific issues related to the number one killer of women, which is cardiovascular disease. So I am a data person. I'm a recovering chemical engineer. I'm an internal medicine women's health physician, and now the dean of a medical school and chief academic officer of a major healthcare system. So to look at trying to sort of round out the FemTech Summit in this closing keynote, I wanted to just give an overview of some of the things that really I look at to see if the needle is really moving in regard to better health for women. So next slide. So achieving an optimal state of health for all, and that includes men, women, boys, and girls, is not possible in today's world. Next. Because we have broken systems. We have ambiguous health policies. After working in the federal government for about 4 years before coming here to the University of South Carolina, I helped to write some health policies. The health policies around women's health and around drug, device, and biologics for ensuring safety and efficacy in women's health have no consequences to them. If you don't follow them, there really are no consequences. There's billions of federal funding supporting one-sex gender-blind research. The NIH budget is $49 billion per year. And even though we have sex as a biological variable policy at NIH, which was enacted in 2016, we still allow researchers to not adequately study women in research that applies to both men and women. We have also decreased our women's health funding over the past decade, and we do not require reporting or data analysis. Accepting healthcare based on a male model. And we're pretty accepting of this in the sense that women are 80% of the global healthcare consumerism, and yet we haven't been able to move this needle. So one thing I would ask that we do is for all of us, whether we're a patient or whether we're a physician, to actually consider whether there's enough data to provide the care that you are prescribing for your female patients and women patients. We are instilling implicit bias through healthcare education. I was not taught sex-specific differences in medical school. We now have a textbook that you heard about. You heard my colleague, Dr. Allison McGregor, speak yesterday, also with a textbook and a consumer book on male-centric medicine. But we still don't have it inculcated through pharmacy, nursing, physical therapy, sports medicine, and medicine itself. And then I talked a little bit about approving drugs, devices, and biologics based on limited human data. I served on a congressional task force in 2018 for the FDA commissioner as his proxy. And it was a task force on research into pregnant and lactating women. And I represented the entire agency on this task force. And during that time, I offered to do an audit of a group of drugs to see how much human data was actually present in the label for over 500 drugs. And we worked with our colleagues at another center, and we found that 76% of those drugs had no human data in relation to pregnant women or lactating women. So pregnant women get sick and sick women get pregnant. And yet we are giving them medications that have absolutely zero human data. And I think that's a travesty. We are protecting women from research instead of protecting women with research. And in many areas, certainly not this audience, because you are breaking out of the status quo, but many are accepting this as the status quo. Well, that's just how it's been for thousands of years. We'll just keep going. And yet women are losing their lives. They are having increased morbidity and mortality because of these broken systems. Next slide. So achieving an optimal future state of health, the crucial link. Next. So it's about being equitable. It's equitable access to care. You've heard about access to care related to women. You've heard about women not having insurance coverage as much or at higher rates as their male counterparts. We have equitable delivery of care. So once a woman has access to care, is she getting equitable care? We know from the literature that women who are underinsured or uninsured actually get different treatment regimens for fairly common and significant illnesses such as breast cancer. Equitable treatment plans. So do the physicians, the pharmacists, the nurses, do they know whether this treatment has been adequately studied in women, or even more so in women of color or other diverse metrics? We need health policies that really have some consequences, that have some teeth to them. You don't get funded if you aren't looking at the data and analyzing the data. And I think in the US and as a taxpayer, I think that I really admire the work of the NIH. I admire the work of the Office of Research and Women's Health, who has done so much over the last quarter century to bring this to bear. But I would really love some of our health policies, both at NIH and FDA, to have some real teeth to them. And equitable investments. And I think wherever we are, whether a venture capitalist or a startup, we should really think about equity when we are studying a new device, when we are launching a new product. I know that FemTech is very transparent about what they are supporting and how much diversity is in those products. And I really appreciated that. We know that there is much lower diversity, especially with race, ethnicity, in many of the products that are brought to market. Next. So the word that I would talk about for just a few moments is equity. And what we choose today impacts our tomorrow. And I want to bring an idea to you that I call stacking. And you may have actually heard this from Dr. McGregor, because she speaks to this as well. So what stacking means is that a demographic or a diversity variable that you have actually increases your risk inordinately if you did not have that. So I'll give you an example. I'm a woman. If I'm a woman of color, I'm much less likely to be enrolled in cardiovascular disease trials. I'm much less likely to be given the clinical guideline treatment in an emergency room setting. I'm much less likely to have access to quality care. So now let's say that I'm a woman of color and I'm in the military. So I'm now in the military in a very male-predominated healthcare infrastructure, and I'm trying to access care for myself. So now I'm discharged from my military service and I'm a veteran. Again, the way that I can afford care is probably through our Veterans Administration. So we now have a woman of color who is a veteran who may have issues related to her service, especially if she was in combat, such as PTSD. higher suicide risk. We heard about mental health issues for women. All of these issues stack up when you start thinking about them and adding them together, such that women are much more marginalized than if we just say, oh, she's a woman, so she doesn't have good access to care. So if you think about stacking, as I've presented it to you related to demographic variables, let's think about stacking when it comes to medications. And we have a woman in the emergency room, and this is a Dr. McGregor example. And she comes in and she has severe pain in her back. And so you test her because you know that she may be having some other issues. So you rule out infection. You check a urine analysis, and she has a urinary tract infection. So you give her an antibiotic, a dose of antibiotic. You also give her a narcotic for the pain because she's in severe pain. And then you look at her list of medications, and she's also on antihistamines. And so now you have 3 drugs that prolong a QT interval, which is an interval on the EKG, which shows if a woman is at risk for a fatal arrhythmia or a fatal heart rhythm. So we've now added on medications already to her list of medications that prolong that interval and could lead to a fatal arrhythmia. So we've now not only stacked her demographic variables against her, but we're also stacking her medications and what we're prescribing against her. Yet, if we all recognize that women at normal, with a normal EKG, has a longer QT interval than a male, so the females have a longer QT interval, we might choose another medication that doesn't have prolonging QT interval as a potential. So I think that while we look at all of the broken systems and we look at the issue of stacking, especially as we're relating to women and women's health, what I would ask you to do, as I ask myself to do every day, is wherever we have a sphere of influence, act with equity related to all populations. Because when we can't just talk about race, ethnicity as a variable. What about disabilities? What about age? All of those matter, but we have probably the most data about disparity with race, ethnicity, and especially as it pertains to Black people. And as it pertains to clinical trials and enrolling Black people, we know that African-American people are 2% enrolled in cancer trials, yet they are 25% enrolled in schizophrenia trials. And that data is on the FDA's website. So how is it that we can only enroll 2% of subjects who are just as likely to have a heart attack or sudden death as the majority, but yet when it comes to schizophrenia, we get 25% Black persons enrolled? What is that about? Well, Black people don't have a markedly higher rate of schizophrenia related to the majority. And so we need to look inward at our systems. We need to see where we have written policies that lead to inequity, where we teach where it leads to implicit bias, where we are putting our influence, whether that's your voice, your power, your authority, your resources, your funding. Ask those questions. And as I said before, if it is not equitable at this time, that is where we are. It does give us a chance to choose today to begin to make a difference, because we know that that will impact our tomorrow and the tomorrow of so many women. Next slide. So Ariana, I will close there, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have time for that.
We do have time for that. Rachel, I don't know if are there questions to post in the private chat. I might start by asking, actually, how did you get into this? I think that's always really interesting how people got into the field. Yeah.
So in 2001, I was in private practice in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was recruited to Texas Tech University for academics. And I was recruited to be a women's health physician and to work in OBGYN and also family medicine and internal medicine to sort of pull it together for women, because we tend to do bikini medicine, right? We send women to OBGYNs. Half of women in the US count their OB-GYN as their primary care physician. So I was there building some lecture series, a women's health fellowship. And in 2002, Marianne Legato's book on gender-specific medicine came out. And it was 800 pages of science about why men and women are different. It's now in, I think it's 4th edition. But I put that book, I told you I was a data nerd when I started this talk. And I put that book by my bedside and I read that book over a year. And I'm a very data-driven person. And so I went into my then dean at the time and I said, I am not going to talk about women's health anymore. And I put that book on his desk. And he goes, well, that's what we hired you for. I said, well, I will talk about sex and gender specific women's health, because when we do that, we also address those issues that are unique to women: menopause, pregnancy, cervical cancer, the gynecological cancers. And so he, what was he going to say? I was going to begin following the evidence. So that was back in 2002. So we're now 20 years later, and it really changed my career trajectory. I started looking at the data. Now we have research coming out every day about the differences between men and women, males and females. So men and women are gendered terms. Gender is a very complex spectrum. Sex is a biological variable, mostly binary, but not always. And so we as scientists actually have propagated a foundation of male-centric medicine for hundreds of years. And we seem to think that that's okay. So once I became the dean here and chief academic officer, there was one thing I had on my bucket list. I have a lot of things on my bucket list when it comes to women's health, but there was definitely one thing on my bucket list that I had wanted to accomplish in the sex and gender realm. And that was a textbook, a very clinically understandable textbook for nurses, pharmacists, physicians. You could take it and you could apply those points to your daily practice today, and it would help take better care of women. And so we did that. And Connie Newman and I led that textbook. It was published in 2020. And so that felt really great to now have enough evidence that was clinically meaningful evidence of the differences between men and women that we could actually write a textbook for providers. So I always tell people, Oriana, that I'm a great person to have at cocktail parties, because I can tell you differences between men and women from the way your hair grows to your ankles or feet. But a lot of the science that we have right now may not be clinically interpretable, but we know that there's a biological plausibility that there are sex differences. So what do I mean by that? I mean, our literature, our research pipeline shows us that basic science, translational science may actually see a signal of sex differences, but we still go into male-centric and one-sex medicine when we deliver care to women. So that's really how I came into this in 2002, how I sort of checked a check mark on my bucket list with that textbook. Also looking at updating that textbook. There's so much more that's come out even in the past few years since we wrote that book. And really just getting our providers, and if there are students and residents on this program, which I think there are, that you be champions for being taught the differences between men and women and males and females, because I think that you deserve to be taught the best way to take care of all of your patients, irrespective of their demographic variables and descriptions. So I do see there's something in the chat here. What do you see as opportunities in care for women in menopause? So that is really interesting. I told you that 50% of women, and thank you for the question, 50% of women actually select their OBGYN as primary care. And yet when women have a hysterectomy and oophorectomy or are finished with childbearing years, or through menopause, suddenly they have to find a new primary care physician. because we don't have their OBGYN, really isn't going to be taking care of them. They've already transitioned through menopause. So the first thing I would do is teach our internal medicine primary care physicians, of which I am one. I am a proud member of that discipline, how to take care of women in menopause. I love the North American Menopause Society and that they give certifications in a menopause practitioner. And I was a certified NAMS menopause practitioner. And I think we need to individualize menopause. But really the bottom line of this is saying menopause is not a disease. And yet we have created this diseased state for women that requires prescription therapies. Some women don't require prescription therapies during menopause. It is the same as we're transitioning through puberty. And in fact, some of it is the same. And as I went through menopause a few years ago, I did get moody and I did have adult acne, which was kind of crazy. And I thought, man, I'm going through puberty again. So it was challenging for me. But I approached my doctor. My doctor spoke with me at length. We created a plan that I could follow for my year of health. And understanding that my journey through menopause might be 2 years, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years. But it was going to be my journey with my practitioner. So I would say, let's not tell women they're sick when they're going through menopause. Let's try to individualize our therapy. Let's be more holistic in our therapies. And let's make women feel valued during this time and understanding that it's a really challenging time for many women.
If I could actually ask you a follow-up question to that. So you talked a lot about arming physicians with the right information, but we also had Dr. McGregor, as you mentioned, talk about how it's starting to change. We want it to change, but I mean, there's a lot of physicians out there that haven't been armed with the correct information, and it's still not routinely integrated into medical education. So in the interim, until it is solved, what do you see as being a potential solution? Do you see technology bridging the gap? Is there a way to bridge the information divide, or how can women go about accessing quality care when the physicians that are practicing aren't armed with the right knowledge?
That's a really great question. I think first and foremost, I would go to what FemTech is founded on, which is creating devices and treatments focused on women and letting women know how to access those. That's a big window of opportunity for us. And I think women, great change has happened in the US for sure around women's health when women were their advocates. We are currently, I'm sure as many on this event would understand, the US is at a real tipping point when it comes to women and reproductive health specifically. And so we have to take all of that into account. But women, the change that came in when women's health became more than breast, the bikini medicine 25 years ago, happened because women rose up. And they began advocating, and they advocated for us through Congress, and they advocated through their state legislatures. And it is really amazing as we've been moving forward in the next quarter century, how many steps backward we are taking in many areas around reproductive health and reproductive rights. So I would ask women and men who love women and have women in your lives to be advocates and to speak up. When a doctor gives you a drug prescription, it's okay to ask, has this been studied in women like me? And if they say, I don't know, or they may say yes, you can go double check that on the internet at the FDA site and see how many women were enrolled in that study. So I think that we have to be our own champions for right now, while working through these broken systems. Run for office. Start being in the power position. Start sitting at the table, because when you're at the table, you have authority and influence to create change that you otherwise might not have. And it's scary to take that step into leadership sometimes. But I would encourage all the brilliant people on this event to go ahead and wherever you see your strengths and your influence, please take them, because we need everybody rowing in that direction.
I think that's the perfect way to close. That's quite a call to action, but I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Ariana.
And for that extremely insightful keynote. I hope everybody.
I'm honored to be here. You're doing great work. Thank you. Keep doing the great work that you guys are doing. And if I can ever be of assistance, please reach out.
100%. And yeah. So on that note, I would start to wrap up this edition of the FemTechnology Summit. Technical issues notwithstanding, I think we can all agree it was incredibly insightful and illuminating, and we loved the energy. We loved those of you who came back for our closing remarks. First and foremost, we have to thank our incredible speakers. You didn't get to hear all of them, unfortunately, but you got to hear most of them. And everything they said was illuminating, and they're truly paving the way, innovating in women's healthcare. We also